What is liturgy? What is happening when we practice it? And how can it help us know God? Here to help us answer these questions is Dr. Joshua Cockayne, a professor at Durham University. Dr. Cockayne joined me to discuss an essay that he wrote in the T&T Clark Handbook of Analytic Theology titled Analytic Theology and Liturgy. A link to the book is in the description below. Let's get started. So, Dr. Cockayne, what is analytic theology?
Yeah, thank you, Jordan. Analytic theology, I think, is a really simple thing. Really, all that it means is theology, which is engaged and is in dialogue with analytic philosophy in some way. I have a very minimal conception of what I think analytic theology is up to. And I think there are different ways you might think about what are some of the kind of norms or the practices of analytic theology. But really, at its base level, it just is theology which seeks to draw from the tools and the literature of the analytic tradition in philosophy to help us think theologically. So that's all that I think it is, really. And I think that the reason we need it is because, in general, philosophical theology, particularly in the West, has been dominated by perhaps more continental thinkers in the philosophical tradition. And I think there's a lot that the analytic tradition in philosophy can bring to the table when thinking about theology. But it's not the only kind of theology that exists. I don't think that analytic theology is the best kind or the only kind. I just think it's one of many tools that you might bring to the task of doing theology well.
Very good. And what is liturgy?
Yeah, liturgy is one of those terms I think that is used in lots of different ways by lots of different people. I'm so I teach people that are training for ministry primarily here in Durham. And one of the things that I hear fairly commonly is I'm not very liturgical, or I'm from a liturgical tradition, is the opposite instincts that you sometimes hear. I think liturgy is really not about formal or informal traditions. Liturgy simply describes the practices that we use to engage with God when we gather for worship. Now, the term has been used in slightly different ways in the literature, which makes things confusing. There's a distinction that I really find helpful between intensive and extensive liturgy. And intensive liturgy really refers to what the church is doing when they gather in public acts of worship. So the content of your services gets to count as intensive worship. Now, you might think that if you're from a more informal tradition, we don't really have any practices or rituals when we gather. And that's clearly false, isn't it? Because if you know what to expect when you turn up to church on Sunday or whatever day you gather to worship, and then there's a ritual in play. If you know that it's appropriate to not shout out your innermost thoughts when the preacher is preaching, you know there's a set of norms or expectations. So that sometimes there's a really formal liturgical script at play in liturgy. In more formal traditions, you have something that you read out at the same time. The structure is really clear. In other traditions, the script might not be written down, but it's still there. And there's a script which dictates the expectations and norms of what it is that we do when we worship. So that's intensive liturgy. But there's another sense of the word liturgy that's sometimes used, which refers to basically what is the church doing when it's not gathered for worship. And I think one of the reasons this is important is theological, because as the church we gather to worship in acts of liturgy, but then we're also sent into the world. I'm an Anglican priest. One of the things that I say at the end of the liturgy is, go in peace to love and serve the Lord. We send the congregation out, and they don't stop being the church when they're sent out. And so the liturgical act, the ways in which they engage with God and participate in the life of the church, continue, but they do so in a slightly different way. And so I think that distinction is really helpful. I think both are really important, and I've thought a little about both kinds of liturgy. The focus of a lot of my research has been on intensive liturgy, the practices that we engage in where we're inside gathered acts of worship.
Okay, yeah, that's really helpful. And where I'm coming from, my whole life I was raised in a not very scripted, or at least not like clearly written out from
Yeah,
beginning to end.
yeah,
Not in that sense scripted sort of background. But like you said, there's still a sequence that was followed
yes.
every Sunday. We begin with worship. There's usually like a greeting after that. There's announcements. The sermon comes. There's more worship, possibly if certain times of the year, communion, and so on. So there's still a structure to it, even in those backgrounds. So that would still count as intensive liturgy, I guess, just maybe not quite as formally structured.
Yeah, and I
But
think it's important that there's a continuity, actually. I think the reason I get frustrated with that I'm not very liturgical comment is I think because it fails to recognize that we're doing the same kind of thing when we gather in an informal, a low church context. We're doing the same kind of thing when we gather as in a high church, a highly structured, formal high church context. The means of doing that's very different, but the kind of thing that we're up to, the kind of actions that we're performing, there's a similarity there. And I think it's important to acknowledge that if we're to be able to talk meaningfully about liturgy.
So the essay that we're discussing was in the T&T Clark Handbook, and you called it Analytic Theology and Liturgy. So there were maybe two big sections of the paper that I thought, okay, we'll spend some time unpacking those sections. So in one section, it seems like you're asking the question, what is happening when both individuals and groups engage in liturgy? What's going on there? And it's not just purely, well, they're singing songs and that's it. I mean, there's a kind of simplistic sense of they're reading these words on the paper or something. But you're looking for a deeper, I guess, a deeper something that's going on there. So unpack that for us.
Yeah, thank you. I think that's a really helpful way of putting it, that I think we do acknowledge that one of the things that we do in liturgy are quite mundane things. Quite simply, we listen, we sing, we talk, we eat. Depending on our tradition, we use our bodies in different ways. In some more formal traditions, you might use the sign of the cross. In a more informal tradition, you might lift your hands up in music. So that on a very simple level, these are actions that are being performed by people in liturgy. I think it's interesting to know, I mean, let's not get too far ahead to the group context yet, but it's interesting to know, just on that example of the body, in more formal traditions, it's quite common for everybody to be doing the same thing at the same time. And so it's very common when certain words are said in the liturgy to make the sign of the cross. In perhaps lower church traditions, there's still a use of the body, but it's not as synchronous. So there might be moments where you can kind of predict in a certain worship song, everyone's hand's going to go up at the same time. But in general, there's a bit more kind of personal agency, individual agency in the lower church tradition. I think that's helpful to notice. But I think what's interesting about liturgy is these really simple tasks, these mundane bodily actions, have a deeper significance. They're usually used to be involved in certain kinds of liturgical actions. So Terence Cuneo, the philosopher, talks about the three liturgical actions of blessing, petitioning, and confessing. And these are actions that are not just things that happen when we use the propositions associated with those things. They're things that occur through the use of the body. So let's take the example of blessing God or expressing thanks to God. There's a really simple way in which you might think about that liturgically, which is we say thanks be to God, or we express thanks for something specific. But there are also other ways in which thanks or blessing might be expressed using the body. Let's stick with the example of the kind of low church tradition. I'm a kind of weird hybrid because I'm a low church Anglican, and I don't think you have that many low church Anglicans in the States. But in the kind of low church Anglican tradition in the UK, it would be fairly common to express thanks by using the body, by putting your hand up when you sing a song. And that's as much an act of thanks as the speech utterance that's used in expressing thanks in a really propositional way. So really what's going on liturgically is these mundane acts have a deeper liturgical significance in that they're seeking to express an attitude towards God in some way. So I think individually, often that's what's going on in liturgy.
Yeah. Okay. Now that's an example of an individual using their body, not just, I guess, speech acts. Like it's not just your speech, but you're using your body to express an attitude toward God. But maybe when we get more into this synchronous among a group, when you get to the group level, there are things that are done liturgically.
Yes.
Unpack those for us.
Yeah, and so I think there are different ways we might think about group actions. And this is why I think analytic philosophy is super helpful, because it provides some really clear distinctions. Let's talk first about what philosophers have called joint action or joint intentionality. A really simple way of understanding what that is imagine you and I are going to perform in an orchestra together or perform a piece of music together. In order to do that well, we have to be aware not just of the piece of music that's in front of us, but we have to be aware of what each other are doing in that act. We have to be attentive to the responses that one another are making. And that's what philosophers have called joint intentions or we intentions. It's not just that I intend to play a piece of music, but I intend to play it whilst being aware that Jordan intends to play it. So we have that joint intention. Now that's taking place, that kind of joint intentionality is taking place in liturgy all the time, from the most formal traditions to the most informal traditions. Nicholas Waldstock gives an example in his book about the really formal liturgical act of reciting the creeds together. He says that reciting, you can read the words of the creeds, but that's not sufficient for saying the creed together. Because what the script doesn't tell you is how loudly you should say it, how quickly you should say it. You have to pace yourself with the other people that are saying it. So that in a really simple way, for us to say the creed jointly, we have to be aware of what's going on with one another. Now, I think in more informal context, this is even more important because there isn't a script there to fall back on. And so you have to be even more aware of how your actions are joining with others, so that what we're performing is not just an act of individual praise, but that we're jointly praising God. Now, this doesn't mean we all have to be doing the same thing. Think about the example of the orchestra. An orchestra full of violin players is not really an orchestra. And I think the same is true in liturgy. And so actually, just because we're not all doing the same thing doesn't mean we can't be expressing a liturgical action jointly. So that's joint action, which involves us really carefully attending to our intentions and meshing our intentions together so that we can perform actions together. But there's another kind of action which philosophers talk about, which I've done a bit of work around, which is sometimes called collective intentions or collective actions. Now, when we talk about collective actions, we're not just talking about two people coordinating their actions. We're talking in some way about a group or a community as a distinct agent able to perform actions. This is reflected often in our legal structures. We hold corporations responsible in law. Suppose an oil company manages to create a massive oil spill in the North Sea, the law would hold the organization responsible for that. They would fine them. And actually, in some senses, it makes little sense to say which individual was responsible for the oil spill. The answer is the corporation, in which many individuals that are contributing to that group action. Now I think something similar is going on in the worship of the church in lots of kind of complex theological layers. On a grand scale, my theology is that it's the church which is active in worship, in responding to God, the global mystical body of Christ. And so in a sense, when we gather as a community on the Sunday, we're in some way participating in that wider scale action. But there's also a sense in which my particular community is acting liturgically in certain ways. So it's true that St. Nicholas's church, to use the church that I worship at, St. Nick's church is praising God on Sundays in a way that doesn't just boil down to joint intentionality. Now, I think to see what we mean by that, you have to kind of pick apart some of the layers a little to think about what's the ontology of a group. So in the example of the oil company, there are different levels of responsibility in that group. The CEO contributes more significantly to the act of oil spillage than the accountant or the cleaner. But in certain ways, they all participate in that company. They're all members of that company, and their individual acts contribute to the actions of that company. Now, where I think this gets really interesting for the church is to think about how it is that those that can't always actively participate are joining in with the actions of the community. So I've got a 2-year-old who struggles to engage very well with what's going on at the front in liturgy, but actually he's a member of that community. I'm an infant Baptist, which is a kind of a conversation for another day, as you know. but actually, in the sense, his baptism shows that he's a member of that community. He's a member of the church. And so when the church praises God, it does so on his behalf, even though his participation in the liturgy is running around the back of the church like a crazy kid and shouting out inappropriate places. There's a sense in which he participates in the worship of that community, but he doesn't do so with the same level of responsibility as the minister or the musician. If the minister was running around doing laps to the back and shouting out, we'd have some issues, right? But there's a sense in which all of those people contribute in the same way that the CEO and the accountant and the cleaner contribute to the actions of the oil company. The members of a church community participate in different ways in the same liturgical acts.
Okay, so that helps us understand both on individual and the group level these acts that in some sense give us, we're interacting with God in a way. Now, if it's okay with you, we'll go ahead and shift to knowing God through liturgy. So this kind of the second half of your paper considers this question: how can liturgy help us to know God? So can you walk us through that?
Yeah, of course. Yeah. So I think it's helpful to, again, here's where the analytic stuff I think is super helpful in cashing out some distinctions. There's a distinction that's sometimes made in epistemology, in understanding knowledge, between, let's just take three kinds of knowing. So there's a propositional knowing, which is knowing that. So I know that I live in Durham. There's a second kind of knowing, which you might call know-how or practical knowledge, which is something like I know how to drive a manual car. That's something I've acquired not just by learning a set of propositions, something that I've had to acquire over practice and over time, with practice and over time. And then a third kind of knowledge you might think of is a personal knowledge. So when I say I know my wife, I'm not just saying I know some facts about her or that I know how to engage her. There's a kind of knowledge which I can gain only by spending time with her. I think to kind of plug your intuitions on this, if you were just to read the Wikipedia page of David Beckham, for instance, that wouldn't be sufficient for knowing David Beckham. In fact, we think there's something weird about that. That's a kind of stalkerish approach to personal knowledge, isn't it? Because it prioritizes propositional knowledge over and above the kind of personal experiential knowledge. So all of those three kinds of knowing have different ways of understanding what it means to know. Now, there's a longer kind of philosophical discussion about whether those things are reducible to one another or not. My intuition is that they're not. And in fact, it's important that they're not. And actually, all three of those kinds of knowing are taking place when we engage in liturgy, or at least that's what I've argued and others have argued in the literature. So let's take them each in turn. There's clearly propositional knowledge that comes about through liturgy. In fact, I think if you want people to understand doctrine and theology, one of the best ways to kind of help them to get that knowledge is to make them recite it, to make them sing it, to make them listen to sermons about it. And it's not just that you hear something and then you believe it. This kind of shapes your beliefs in complex and subconscious ways. So actually, I think the implicit theological content of things like hymns is really important, because it shapes what we know about God. So that's propositional knowledge, which we're acquiring tons of propositional knowledge when we engage in liturgy. Secondly, know-how. And I think one of the proponents of this view in liturgy that I think is most helpful is Terence Cuneo. So Terence has some really interesting work in this area. And Terence basically makes the observation that liturgy is engaging not just with propositions, but is engaging with a kind of practical skill. It's the way in which we learn how to engage properly in liturgy is in some ways similar to the way in which we learn how to drive a car. We learn how to participate in these rituals and different traditions, regardless of how high or low they are, by doing them over time. So in a really basic sense, we learn how to engage well in, like if you've just joined our Anglican church, you're learning how to engage in the sharing of the peace. And that's not just learning.
I've messed that up really big the first
time. Exactly. but there's a sense in which like you can only learn that by being embedded in that community. Mm-hmm. So in a certain sense, that's there's a kind of really immediate practical knowledge, but then Cuneo says that kind of practical knowledge also gives us knowledge of how to engage God. So it links back to the previous conversation we had. That mundane act of sharing peace with the community has a deeper significance, which is there's something theologically that we're claiming that engaging with others, we somehow engaging with God through that community. And so the idea is that if you're learning how to engage through this kind of ritual knowledge, you're learning how to bless God, how to thank God, how to petition God. And that's not just something that you've learned propositionally. It's something that you've learned through that kind of practical repetition of certain actions.
Mm-hmm.
And then lastly, the personal knowledge thing, which I think is a really important aspect to it. I think one of the key things that liturgy does is it allows us to encounter God. It's not just that we learn about God and learn these kind of abstract ways of engaging God, but we are attentive to God's presence in a personal way. And so liturgy is a means of encounter, in much the same way that I described the way in which I know my wife is by spending time with her. I think one of the things that liturgy does, if it's working well, is it's a means of allowing us to encounter the presence of God and the person of God, whether that's through hearing the words of Scripture, whether that's through encountering Christ in the sacrament, or whether it's through a kind of low church, Pentecostal, charismatic kind of ministry time. There are lots of different ways in which liturgy facilitates encounter. But I think that's a really crucial part of thinking about knowledge, is not just this kind of abstract distance, but a close personal knowledge of God, which liturgy facilitates.
So I read this book recently. I'm sure you're familiar with it, The Anglican Way by Thomas Mackenzie. Have you heard that?
I haven't actually read it, but I've come across it, yeah.
So it's supposed to be like, hey, if you're just getting into Anglicanism and you're like, what in the world's going on when they're doing this stuff, it kind of helps you understand that. So learning like why there's two candles and why there are, well, like our musicians aren't on the stage. I really like this, actually. They're like off to the side. They're kind of on our level, but the stage is like elevated, and there's the altar up there, and we bring the offering, like the money that we give up. They break the bread there every week. Like that's very significant. The gospel procession, when they come down and we bow. And so these are all things that I've had to like, I'm like looking around is now when we bow, I'm trying to I'm learning through that know-how, like you talked about, and when to make the sign of the cross. But it's been really fun to engage in, and I really enjoy that those actions have this deeper layer of meaning.
Yes.
That, once I guess in some sense, I don't know if that's the propositional part. Like I know that when the cross enters, that's representing Christ in leading us into the church, and when the cross moves toward the exit, it's Christ sending us back out into the world. That's like that knowledge that I'm just feeling. You can correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm assuming it's something like that. But then I'm learning the know-how, like when to bow, when to make the signs. But also I'm in engaging in these actions and having that propositional knowledge. I'm coming to know God. And it's been a lot of fun to transition into this sort of church. Yeah,
and I think that's a good example of how actually those things, they even if they're not reducible to each other, they inform each other in really important ways. When you're learning how to drive a car, I think it's true that you can't learn how to drive a car by reading a book about driving cars, but actually you probably learn how to drive a car quicker if you've been reading a book about driving cars, because the propositional informs the practical. And I think that's kind of what you're describing there, that actually you're being immersed in a new community, you're learning the kind of practical bodily rhythms, but actually in reading a book about that, or by going through some kind of catechesis, you're giving that practical step you're getting some propositional knowledge about that practical knowledge that you're gaining. And so I think those things are really connected. It would just as it would be odd to claim you know David Beckham by reading his Wikipedia page, it would also be odd to say you knew your wife but you knew nothing about her.
Sure.
That would seem absurd too. So these things are clearly connected in quite intricate ways, and they inform one another. but it can still be helpful to kind of artificially pull them apart to help analyze the different things that might be going on.
All right. Well, I really appreciate you joining me to discuss liturgy. And if anyone wants to find out maybe more about your work, where can they go?
So you can put a link to my website. You can get my articles and links to the books that I've been involved with over there. So do please have a look at some of the stuff I've been involved with.
I want to thank TNT Clark for providing me a copy of this book. Another fascinating essay in the book is on the topic of the Eucharist. It explains how the body and blood of Christ are really present in the Eucharist. If that interests you, click right here to watch the interview with Dr. James Arcadi right now.